The topic is animals and big business, i.e. the mega corporation. We have three excellent presenters. The first who will explain how it came to be in his mind, and based on something he sees something like as a myth, that animals came to be commodities in the world of big business. So our first speaker is Professor David Cassuto from Pace Law School.
I wonder if you all are feeling as sorry for me as I am having to follow Gary. But be that as it may, it's so wonderful to be at a conference like this. Again, just speaking personally, usually when I'm at any kind of gathering of any sort, I'm the weirdo outlier if animal issues come up. And here, my supposedly radical ideas make, folks like Gary roll their eyes and say, come on, Cassuto, give me something I can use. and that's just great, because here we are, we're in a forum where we're actually trying to push the envelope a little bit, and that's just so inspiring for me. But to the matter at hand, which is that over the past several decades, the term animal husbandry, if you ever accepted that it had a meaning and any sort of compassionate side to it, it's gone. The term has become more ironic than referential, because the care of animals raised for human consumption has devolved into an industrial operation that's focused on maximizing economic return while paying absolutely no heed at all to the needs of the stock. And so even though this practice is rife with issues and practices that might otherwise invite governmental scrutiny and criticism and outrage, industrial agriculture in the United States operates in a regulatory environment, as we've heard, that endorses and even subsidizes its methods. And discussions of factory farming often segue into apologies for or against animal rights. And we've heard plenty of that today, and it's a valuable discussion. And I'd like to take a slightly different tack, although I do want to talk a little bit about the rights issue, and I will at the end, but I want to approach it from a different perspective. I want to talk about how and why the factory farm industry could grow ascendant in an era where the notion of the human-animal divide, this supposed distinction between us and them, humans and animals, has become increasingly blurred. And what do I mean by that? I mean that most every trait, whether it be language, tool use, self-consciousness, or whatever you want to say, can be found in animals that range from dolphins to pigeons. And Gary mentioned earlier that we're one chromosome away from a chimpanzee, and that's absolutely right. And we can even take that further. Our genome is virtually indistinguishable from a roundworm. So what are we talking about when we talk about biological distinctions? I submit we're talking nonsense. So on the one hand, society seems to recognize the inequities involved in excluding animals from the moral community. And on the other, it's facilitating industrial agriculture. So what's up with that? These opposing trends and their ability to coexist is an intriguing sociological paradox. And the ability of industrial farms to commodify animals stems in large part from the legal system's embrace of a secularized but nonetheless deeply religious view of human ascendancy. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that in a few minutes, but let me just flag this for you. It's one thing for society to have a religious bent, as this one most assuredly does. But it's quite another for the legal system to have a religious bent. Our Constitution has an amendment, the first one, that's designed to prevent institutionalized state-sponsored religion. Nonetheless, I believe, that's what we have, particularly with respect to the human-animal distinction. So in order to get where I'm hoping we're going to go today, we need to cover 4 major themes. And some of them have already been covered, so that makes it just that much easier. First, we need to understand the structure of the system separating humans from other animals, and that will involve discussing the concepts of inherent versus exchange value. And this is the bifurcated mode of valuation that underlies the factory farm economy. And the next thing is to at least acknowledge, although it's been very graphically and ably covered earlier today, the factory farm system itself. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, and I'm also not going to delve too deeply into the economics, because both Gary has just discussed it with you, and Darian, I think, is going to do as well. We're then going to come to my main thesis, which is that the dominance of industrial farming and other forms of animal exploitation, although I'm not going to deal with them today, derives largely from the ascendancy of this religious belief that has attained a protected status within the legal system. And religion, for my purposes today, is not an explicitly theistic or God-based concept. I'm rather referring to a system of norms that's based on hypothesis rather than fact. Okay? The religious principle at issue here, for my purposes, is this canard of a morally relevant divide between humans and animals. And to see how entrenched this paradigm has become, we're going to discuss the supposedly secular explanation of human evolution that was offered by Freud. And then we're going to examine how the human-animal divide has assumed a quasi-constitutional protected status. And in my longer paper, I talk at some length about the 1993 Supreme Court case of the Church of Lukumi Babalu I versus the city of Hialeah, which centered on a dispute between the city of Hialeah, Florida, and a Santeria church that wished to carry out animal sacrifice within the city limits. The court struck down the city ordinances that barred animal sacrifice because they, in the court's view, violated the free exercise clause of the First Amendment, the free exercise clause being the one that says no, the state can make no law that inhibits the free exercise of religion. Well, by protecting animal sacrifice as a First Amendment right, the court embraced the idea that non-human animals are the subjects of, rather than participants in, the legal system, and that their well-being is subordinate to human desires. Now, again, let me flag this for you. Not just subordinate to humans, but subordinate to human desires. Another word for desire, whimsy. Okay? So this is a kind of a radical idea. It's not just humans, animals, you put them on a scale and humans win. It's rather human desires and animals. You put them on a scale, and the human desires win. So there, and I want to show how, though the Lukumi case has no overt relationship to industrial farming, its reasoning nevertheless provides a very powerful lens through which to view the agricultural practices in which we subjugate and commodify non-human animals. To effectively address this, again, as Gary was talking about earlier, will involve unraveling a very tightly woven cultural quilt, and that's a job that's going to take, at a minimum, a while. And it's going to require jettisoning this idea of the human-animal divide and instead constructing what I'm going to offer today, or at least call, a rhetoric of the post-human. And I'm going to spend the last few minutes of my talk today trying to sketch that out. But before we can get to the post-human, we have to first tackle the non-human. So let's turn to the roots of the commodification issue. An object's value within society can take two primary forms, that is, how we value something. It can have inherent value, or it can have exchange value. Inherent value confers membership in the moral community. Members possess normative and legal protections that are objective, permanent, and incontrovertible. And these are the ones that Thomas Jefferson was referring to in the Declaration of Independence when he called certain rights inalienable. Now, whether or not they're actually inalienable is a discussion for another day. I would say they're not. But let's just assume, for the purposes of our discussion today, that inherent value means inalienable. Well, the counterpode to inherent value is exchange value. And that's a worth that's neither innate nor imbued with accompanying rights. exchange value defines an object's worth in a market economy, and it stands to reason that the object of exchange has no inherent value since its worth is acquired through its worth to others. And it serves, therefore, as a means to the end of others, rather than an end in itself, and it follows, therefore, that an assigned exchange value necessitates exclusion from the moral community. Commodifying animals confers an exchange value that, at least in the case of meat animals, is realized through their death and dismemberment. For animal producers, which is a euphemism but refers to milk cows and breeding sows and animals of that nature, their value emerges through maximizing productivity while minimizing cost. In neither instance does the animal's quality of life enter the equation at all. Instead, in both cases, the economic incentive lies with minimizing expenses associated with the animal property while maximizing its yield, and it's easy to see how this logic leads to factory farms. It's also easy to see how that logic leads from factory farms to the factory farms' vertical integration to where we are now, where a few large conglomerates control the animal production process from squeal to meal, as their propaganda proudly proclaims. Those aren't my words. That's Smithfield Farms. They love to say that. So within this economic system, animals become things. Things as opposed to persons under the law. Persons, I'm not talking about human beings, I'm talking about legal persons, and we'll talk about that later, acquire legal protections only if that protection serves the purpose of the rights holders being humans. And it follows that these things can be sacrificed if that sacrifice will benefit humans. And this principle, this idea that you can sacrifice things if that sacrifice will benefit humans, underlies the case of Lukumi Babalu, the animal sacrifice cases. And in this sense, this principle of religious animal sacrifice differs very little from the principle of animal sacrifice within the market economy. In both contexts, human owners alienate valued commodities in the hopes of advancing their material condition. With religious sacrifice, you want to please the gods and thereby improve your lot. With respect to a market economy, you sacrifice possessions in order to amass greater wealth and further your economic station. They're very analogous phenomena. And essential to the human-animal distinction that drives both these things, but again, now I want to circle back to the factory farm apparatus, is a need to define humans as a being apart, or if you will, a breed apart from other species. But as I mentioned earlier, there's no ethological basis for this principle. It's a belief, a religious belief, nothing more, and it should be treated as such under the law. But it's not. And now, just to reiterate, I'm here referring not to the traditional dominion rhetoric that infuses Western religious traditions. I'm more referring to the underlying idea that humans are somehow scientifically and behaviorally distinct from animals. And just to illustrate how this has become a scientific principle, let's turn to our friend Freud, who describes the emergence of humans as resulting from our simian forebears beginning to walk upright and discovering, to their horror, that blood and feces, once the primary attraction of living at ground level, have actually lost their allure. And he attributes this to a diminution of olfactory stimuli, which means that what was once sexually exciting is now kind of disgusting. And this led to the development of aesthetic sense, in his view, and a certain contemplative distance, quintessentially human characteristics that spurred the appearance of human civilization. Well, let's think about this for a second. For Freud, the act of becoming human actually requires an already intact human sensibility. The human being who becomes human only through what Freud refers to as an act of organic repression, that is to say, repressing the desire for bodily fluids, has to already know that this organic phenomenon is repulsive and needs to be repressed. In other words, that being who has to already be human. And this means that what Freud is offering to us as an evolutionary truth, the thing that actually separates us from animals, is actually a post hoc act of self-definition. And as the circularity of Freud's origin myth becomes evident, and it is a myth, we can see that defining non-human animals through a predilection for filth and asocial behavior has certain advantages. For example, warehousing vast quantities of animals in close confinement forces them to wallow in, what do you know, excrement. It also puts them in stultifyingly close proximity while depriving them of sensory stimuli. The confinement creates a constant need for infusions of antibiotics, amputations, genetic manipulation, and so forth in order to ward off disease and mayhem. In other words, factory farming turns animals into animals, a problem that's solved through human intervention. Well, this impression is one of where animals dwell in filth and violence, and humans possess this delicate aesthetic sense, which is satisfied through subjugating and commodifying them, seems pretty nifty if you're a factory farmer. And you can see how the durability of this human-animal distinction begins to make sense. And also, given the social and economic benefits of this arrangement for humans, it's also easy to see why it would enjoy a favorable regulatory environment. All right, well, this may all seem like an unfortunate but understandable progression, societally speaking, but if the human-animal distinction is a fundamentally religious precept, then the Establishment Clause, which bars the establishment of any state-sponsored religion, should prevent it from forming the basis for any legal framework. Yet courts, including the Supreme Court, unquestioningly accept animals' exclusion from the moral community. And the best illustration for this reasoning is the Lukumi Babalu case, which, as I say, I cover in some detail in my longer paper, and I just want to give you the 15-second version right now. The Santeria Church of Lukumi Babalu wanted to establish this church within the Hialeah city limits and perform animal sacrifice. The city government was appalled and passed ordinances banning animal sacrifice. The church sued, claiming violation of their First Amendment rights. The Supreme Court, this made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, which agreed with the church, claiming, among other things, that the city had gerrymandered its statute to bar only animal killing as religious expression, not any other form of animal killing. And as such, it was an impermissible target of religion, and therefore a violation of the First Amendment. Well, the court's logic really doesn't withstand close analysis. Accepting animal sacrifice as protected expression involves exempting a form of killing from all normative scrutiny. The other forms of animal killing that the court cites, hunting, fishing, slaughter for food, pest removal, that kind of thing, they all are at least nominally regulated. The court's opinion embraces the idea that animal deaths are less important than the faith-based human value driving their killing. Now, again, not less important than humans, less important than human values driving their killing. And this position necessarily requires allegiance to the fundamentally religious precept that humans and animals are morally distinct and that humans occupy a privileged place in the ethical framework. And it's here that the opinion becomes ensnarled in its own logic, even as it insists on this constitutional principle, this foundational constitutional principle that laws and regulations must be secular in origin. The court nevertheless stamps this religiously derived human-animal distinction with its constitutional imprimatur. The court's reasoning also presumes that sacrificial animals don't enjoy any inherent rights at all, which might interfere with their demise. If they did otherwise, it would necessitate weighing the interests of the Santerian church members in the unfettered practice of their faith against the interests of the affected animals in not being ritually killed. And this kind of balancing test is fundamentally unworkable, as Gary has argued. Classifying animals as things means that their interests can't possibly outweigh the interests of legal persons. Things are property. They're a means to human ends, while humans are ends in themselves. So if we weigh a person's interests against the tools used to accomplish those interests, guess who's going to win? The interests of property simply can't supplant property interests. So, all right, from churches back to farms, how do we get there? Well, along the path of animals as means to an end. The reasoning that I just laid out unquestioningly accepts that human acts and beliefs, not just the humans, deserve special protections under the law because humans are legally distinct from animals. And the reason that humans are legally distinct from animals is because the law codified that distinction. In other words, animals merit fewer legal protections because they have fewer legal protections. That's where I come from. We call that a tautology. Okay? While simple legislative acts could incrementally ease the situation, we could grant birds the protections of the Humane Slaughter Act. We could do away with the generally accepted practices exemption to animal cruelty laws. But this wouldn't do anything. This would neither resolve the problem nor address the underlying issues. It would amount to be a statutory fairy tale. And you know, I think about, for example, you know, for me it's all about words. And I'll talk about this at the end, but really the words we use drive the values we create. That norms come from words, and words are extremely powerful. And so, you know, we think about, you know, the lullaby we sing to children, you know, hush little baby, don't sing a word, daddy's going to buy you a mockingbird, and if that mockingbird doesn't sing well, he's going to buy you a diamond ring. So what do we learn from that? We learn that birds are fungible, especially if they don't serve our needs. You know, yeah, it's a cute little song, and it's a great blues song, but it's a bad idea to be instilling this kind of value. And the words themselves are important. And in order to elevate animals from, I should say non-human animals, from this ruthless realm of thinghood in which they dwell, it's going to require reordering the social and legal systems. And the first step will entail shifting the legislative focus from the boundaries of the human to the frontier of the post-human. And I just want to take a few minutes to take a preliminary look at what will inevitably be a long and complex dialogue. And it starts with doing away with this legal notion of personhood as a relevant legal characteristic. It's just unworkable. Along with the status of non-human animals, personhood fails to adequately address the quandaries raised by embryos, fetuses, brain-dead people, corporations, nation-states, etc., all of which enjoy some form of personhood, but the courts aren't really quite sure what. And the difficulty stems from the fact that person doesn't refer to a single concept, but rather to a range of characteristics. It's what's called a cluster concept. And this means that it doesn't stand for a single idea, but rather for an aggregation of ideas. Person could include biological humanity, rational agency, unity of consciousness, and so on. And this heterogeneity can lead to confusion over who and what is entitled to membership in the moral community. I could see a lively debate, for example, regarding the personhood of a cloned human with a pig's heart, a mechanical arm, and genetically altered DNA. Is that a person? Well, you know, that debate, while epistemologically interesting, should be legally irrelevant. One doesn't have to be a person in order to have rights. One rather needs to have rights in order to be a person. And when determining whether or not a being possesses rights, the question should not be whether that aspirant is a person. The question should rather be whether it possesses the salient qualities for the conferral of rights. And the upshot is that no one definition of person comfortably encompasses the range of entities with claims to personhood. And courts traditionally get around this problem by cluttering the landscape with legal fictions. And all those do is really create more trouble, you know, creates work for lawyers, and like Gary, I love work for lawyers, but it also creates long-term problems. And any discussion of rights and membership in the legal community would be better served by focusing on the components of the term, rather than the term itself. And my view is that different traits demand different entitlements, and clustering them all beneath the term person just creates imprecision. By contrast, if we separate the term into components, that allows the legal system to treat difference differently, while still enabling access, in a general way, to the moral community. So replacing personhood with a cluster concept of rights offers a point of embarkation to this post-human world. And the existence of a multiplicity of beings that offer varying demands on the legal system should lead to an expanded universe of legal entitlements, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. Granting rights to non-human animals doesn't mean granting them the same rights that all beings enjoy, differently. As Peter Singer, among others, has observed, a cow could live her entire life very happily in a pasture in New Jersey. Now, the same might not necessarily be said of Darian here. You know, the like entitlements and protections to which cows and humans should respectively be entitled vary. And a post-human legal landscape acknowledges these differences. It allocates protections based on the requirements of the various beings that form the moral community. And this could mean, for example, that since farm animals are sentient and they have the capacity to suffer, they should not be subjected to the grotesque, inhumane conditions of the factory farm. But it might mean, and I don't know the answer to these questions. I had a constitutional law professor once who was just absolutely Captain Socratic. He never answered a question, and people finally ended up getting really mad at him because he would never answer a question. And the reason he said is because I don't know the answer to these questions. What makes you think they're answers to these questions? Well, I'm now posing some questions that I just don't know the answer to. Could it mean could this cluster concept mean that there may be an ethical form of agriculture that includes animals? I don't know. Similarly, domestic animals have a right to food and comfort and friendship from their human companions. They also most assuredly have a right to bodily integrity. But given the demands that these expectations place on humans, is it per se unreasonable to require that these domestic animals be neutered or spayed? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Both these scenarios involve a rights framework that's drastically different from the one that humans enjoy. And therein, depending on whether you embrace or reject this concept, lies the flexibility of the post-human cluster approach to rights. Legal entitlements vary according to the nature and needs of the user, and this acknowledges the need to move away from humanity as a measuring stick for rights. The status quo, right now, the way we have things is based on a specious and unsustainable divide between humans and other beings, and it's legally suspect and it's ethically bankrupt. This we know. It's allowed a fundamentally religious idea to govern access to their legal system, and it's enabled a brutal, amoral commercial enterprise to operate with next to no regulatory oversight. This cannot stand. What are we going to do about it? I don't know. Normative reconfiguration never happens easily. But the post-human era is upon us. It has dawned. It's with us. We're living it. And the only remaining question is what we're going to do about it. Thank you.
Our next presenter is on the law faculty at the University of Arizona and teaches both animal law and corporations law, and is going to draw on his expertise in these areas now. Darian Ibrahim.
You know, being out in Arizona and not seeing much pasture, that doesn't sound like such a bad change from cacti and rattlesnakes. But I'm going to talk about corporations today. I promise, even though it's about corporations, it's also about animal law, and it won't be too boring. I do have a southern accent, so, you know, maybe you all will stick around because, you know, it's familiar down in these parts. Let me start with a quote from an American pig farmer that I think succinctly captures the problem I'm going to explore. The quote goes as follows: "We're no different from any other business. These animal rights people like to accuse us of mistreating our stock, but we believe we can be most efficient by not being emotional. We are a business, not a humane society, and our job is to sell merchandise at a profit. It's no different from selling paper clips or refrigerators." Actual quote from a modern-day American pig farmer. Now, many people would say, many people in this room would say, and many people outside this room would say, there's quite a big difference between selling an animal on the one hand that's a sentient being capable of experiencing pleasure and pain, and then selling a paper clip or a refrigerator on the other hand, which are inanimate objects. This pig farmer sounds a lot like René Descartes, the infamous, famous for philosophy, infamous for his views of animals, philosopher from the 17th century, who thought that animals were mere automata, machines who could not think or feel. Now, virtually everyone, lay people, people who live with cats and dogs, philosophers, scientists, everyone rejects this now. So why does this modern-day American pig farmer still sound like a Cartesian? Well, my talk today is designed to help answer that question, and in doing so, to shed some light on why animal welfare is so bad in the United States. And then I'm going to analyze two possible solutions for doing something about it. One that's not very drastic, but I also think is not going to be very effective, and then one that is more drastic, but I think will be effective. First, the problem. Why are Descartes' views still being espoused in modern-day America? Well, the first reason is something Gary Franchon talked about today and has talked about at length. Animals are still legal property. So in the eyes of the law, they really are no different than paper clips or refrigerators or other inanimate objects. The second reason, what I kind of hope to add to the discussion, so I don't just steal all Gary's good ideas, is a bit more about who is using animals in the United States. It's not, for the most part, human beings. It's business corporations, and particularly agribusiness corporations, as 98% of our domestic animal use is for food, as you've heard earlier today. And agribusiness corporations have come to dominate the market. Now, Gaverick Matheny says this well in his paper. He says the animal welfare issue is numerically reducible to the farm animal welfare issue. And that's true. So my talk, while I think corporate influence is prevalent in all animal exploitation, institutional animal exploitation, I'm going to focus on agribusiness today because it's the most numerically significant use. Why is it important that corporations own most animals rather than individuals? Well, for one, individuals operate on a smaller scale. For two, they have some moral limits on their behavior. They have to face the cost. When they kick a dog, they feel bad. Corporations, on the other hand, operate on a larger scale, and under the traditional view of corporate law, they are directed by legal and market pressures to use their property, including animals, because animals are classified as property, in whatever way will maximize profits for shareholders, regardless of the consequences. Legally, managers of corporations, directors and officers, I'm referring to them collectively as managers, they have fiduciary duties to act in the best interest of the corporation. The law imposes these. Well, the shareholders are the residual owners of the corporation, so this means acting in the best interest of shareholders. Why do shareholders invest in corporations? To make money. So the fiduciary duties are reducible to make as much money as possible for the shareholders. Now, the market also directs a focus on profit maximization. If a manager does not maximize profits, bad things happen. Shareholders sell their stock. They move their investments. Wall Street analysts downgrade your stock. Bad for the corporation, bad for you as a manager. And not just in terms of your job security, often your compensation is paid in company stock. So you're hurting the shareholders financially and you're hurting yourself financially when you don't maximize profits. Well, what does this have to do with animals? Managers of agribusiness corporations have responded to and embraced this traditional view of corporate law and these market pressures. They've adopted factory farming precisely because it maximizes profits. It does so in two ways. It boosts output. Okay, the more animals we run through the factory farms, the more animals we slaughter, the more profit we're going to make. Also, we make no allowance for animal welfare because that's corporate overhead. That's cost. So we reduce that. We increase output, we reduce cost, and this, what's in between, is your profit margin. The bigger this is, the better, okay? This is evident in factory farming processes. I'm only going to talk about two. First, housing. It's efficient to move animals indoors, as most factory farms do. It saves on land costs and labor costs. You can have more animals in a smaller space, and you can have less people monitoring them because they're all right there in front of you. You can also save on feed costs. If you pack them in and they can't move, well, they eat less to gain slaughter weight. They're not burning calories. Okay, so these are just examples of how these practices do come down to efficiency, as others have said today, and how efficiency is driven by the law and the market to maximize profits. This is also seen in slaughter. Jeff Welty talked about the Humane Slaughter Act. Gail Eisnitz wrote a book called Slaughterhouse that's really powerful and disturbing, talks about animals being slaughtered while conscious. Well, this is the result of line speeds getting really, really fast because they're trying to boost output to boost profits. So that's the problem. Legal and market pressures combine to keep managers of agribusiness corporations focused on maximizing profits, and this means no allowance for animal welfare. It's expensive. It's expensive. Because corporations own most animals in America today, not individuals but corporations, I contend that corporate ownership is one of the most significant and negative effects on animal welfare there is. So possible solutions. How do we mitigate or eliminate the negative effects of corporate ownership on animal welfare? Well, let me start with the less drastic solution that I think is kind of bogus. Corporate social responsibility is an idea that's taken hold in the corporate law literature. It's this notion that corporations are not just economic institutions, but they're also social actors. They have a big effect on society, and therefore they should behave responsibly. Now, the notion of corporate social responsibility is usually applied to human rights, the environment, but some corporations try and apply it to animals, and they usually do so in the form of offering improved processes. They're still raising and killing animals, but they say, we do it better, we're nicer. We're nicer when we do it. Therefore, you should shop with us. Corporate social responsibility gets around the fiduciary duty problem that I talked about through a little trick called the business judgment rule, which any of you who have taken corporations know about the business judgment rule. It says that so long as managers have a rational basis for their decision making, that they think the decisions they make are going to increase profits, no judge or jury will come in and second guess whether they actually do. Well, the rational basis for offering improved processes is, hey, people are going to like us because we're nicer to animals, so they're going to shop with us and not our competitor. So even if this actually ends up decreasing profits because you're spending more on animal welfare, nobody can second guess that. Okay, so the law isn't really the problem. You can get around that. But the problem is the market. Okay, you're still directed by market pressures to focus on profit maximization in the short term. If you don't hit your numbers, okay? You know, public agribusiness corporations are public corporations. They submit reports to the SEC. They report their earnings each quarter. And if you don't meet analyst expectations, well, all those bad things I talked about before happen. Shareholders sell their stock, bad for you in your job as a manager, and bad for you personally because the value of your stock options have gone down. So you're still going to be directed, even if the law lets you get around it a little bit, you're still going to be directed by the market to act in a manner that increases profits. There is one way to do this, okay? There is one way to kind of do good while doing well. And that's, if you wish to engage in socially responsible behavior, you can do so as long as those extra costs you incur can be passed along to consumers in the form of increased product prices. And sometimes people will pay more for a product if they think it's been made in an ethical manner. But there are problems with this when you apply it to animal welfare, at least in the form of improved processes. First, it's not a workable solution for most people or most animals because it's expensive. Most people actually prefer factory farming, not in theory, but in their roles as consumers because it's cheaper. The best evidence we have of this is the last 50 years of American agriculture. Used to be all family farming, now it's all factory farming. If consumers truly wanted family farming and the improved husbandry and slaughtering processes that it afforded, they wouldn't have been buying factory farm products at the market and allowed factory farms to come in and wipe out family farms. Animal welfare is expensive, and I'm just going to give 3 examples of why I think this. Organic meat. Okay, organic meat just means one change, no antibiotics. Doesn't necessarily say anything else about animal welfare. Organic meat said to cost 30 to 40% more. Just that one change. Another change, Gaverick talks about this in his paper. In 1999, the UK put a ban on gestation crates, which means that instead of confining sows by bars, you put them just in a big shed where they're confined by each other. Okay, not a significant improvement in my opinion in their lives. And pork costs supposedly shot up in the UK by 40%. Again, one change, you're almost doubling. No, yeah, well, I don't know my numbers. 40%. 40%, yeah, 40%. We'll stick with that. Stick to the text, man. 40%. You're shooting up your cost of pork by 40%. Big increase in cost for one change. An example of what true animal welfare might cost may come from Switzerland. I was driving into work I think it was October, because I looked it up to cite it in my piece, and I heard something on NPR that was talking about Swiss agriculture, which is said to be more friendly, at least in some segments, to the animals. They were talking about how expensive it is. They said the Swiss government has to subsidize up to 90% of farmers' income sometimes, just so they can afford to engage in family farming or something close to that. And it's still, even with that 90% subsidy, it's still, pork chops over there are said to cost 600% more than they do in neighboring Germany. 600% more, about $20 a pound. Now, I don't eat pork chops, but I called around to some grocery stores right before I came to this conference. They said about $5 a pound here. So that's a significant increase for having somewhat of a better life. So while the Swiss people care about animal welfare in theory, the NPR report says that as consumers, they just can't afford it. So they leave the country. They cross the border into Germany to buy their pork chops. That's their shopping expedition, then they come back because they just can't afford to pay for it. So I contend that animal welfare in the form of improved processes to make meaningful improvements in the lives of farm animals, not token improvements, but meaningful ones, will be a solution only for the upper class, okay? Not a workable solution for most people or most animals. Now, even companies that attempt to cater to this niche market, which I think now is about 2%, there's a 2% market for improved husbandry processes in the form of meat in the United States. Even companies that attempt to cater this market will only be able to pass along the costs of minor improvements because they are so expensive. The danger is they're going to say, hey, our animals are living a good life now. They're all happy. They're all happy. But they're so you're misleading the consumer. You're engaging in puffery. You're misleading the consumer. And the consumers are buying these products instead of going vegan, thinking they're getting a lot more welfare than they actually are. For example, Whole Foods, Gary alluded to, Austin, Texas-based grocery chain, not in Tucson, but I used to have it when I was in Atlanta. They have animal welfare standards. They say they're rigorous. They say they are the antithesis of factory farming. I took one look at the standards and I noticed two big omissions right off the bat. First, presently at least, they don't apply to chickens, which are at least 85% of the animals slaughtered. Second, they don't apply to slaughter. They don't apply to slaughter. Slaughter is said to be, but Jeff said this earlier, Ian Duncan, who's a noted professor of animal science and animal welfare, says this in an article. It says, the 24 hours leading up to slaughter and slaughter themselves are the most stressful time in an animal's life and have the most significant impact on animal welfare. Whole Foods doesn't address them. So that's the problem. You say, well, Whole Foods has standards. You know, why can't I buy their meat? Because the standards are merely branding. Okay, you've also seen this in labeling, and Jeff Leslie takes a somewhat different view of labeling than I do. I think the kind of labeling that happens now, at least, is somebody will stamp animal care certified, while Compassion Over Killing sued and won because they said this animal care certified eggs are coming from battery cage facilities. Also, the free farm label is another one that's popular. You buy free farm meat. You say, well, I don't need to go vegan. I can buy free farm meat. These animals are treated well. Guess who runs the free farm program? A former lobbyist for the pork industry in Colorado. They have no certification or auditing requirements for the free farm program. So even if they say they're doing something, nobody's checking. So I think that the lives of some of these animals, maybe the lives of Whole Foods animals, are somewhat better. Okay, I'm not going to deny that they're making some positive improvements, but this is often, corporate social responsibility coming in this form is often just a branding tool used to boost corporate profits and ease consumer guilt about not taking the extra step and going vegan. Consumers think they're getting a middle ground, factory farming here. And I think one of the questions asked about this, factory farming here, veganism here, is there anything in between? Well, that's what Whole Foods and all these other things purport to offer. But really, I contend they're way over here. They're not making meaningful improvements, and they can't because it's too expensive. Now, what would work? Something more drastic, something Gary's talked about for years, and I echo it wholeheartedly. Get animals out of the status of property. In terms of what I'm talking about today, if you got them out of the status of property, corporations can no longer own them. There would be no traditional view of corporate law that leads to factory farming. There would be no temptation to cut corners on animal welfare and say you're offering more animal welfare than you actually are. You get them out of there altogether. Corporations can't own them and can't do these things to them anymore. More interesting question is, how do you do it, right? And Gary talked a little bit about this. You can look at significant legislation, legislative prohibitions, but you need a bigger base. So I wholeheartedly echo his calls for more social education about the benefits to animals, humans, and the environment that come from veganism. Keeping with my corporate market-based theme, the question is whether corporations and markets, the very things that I contend have such a bad influence on animal welfare, can actually be used for good. Can actually be used to help incrementally eradicate the property status of animals. I think they can. This may be somewhat controversial, but I think they can. Corporations are value neutral in the sense that their only value is money. They don't care what they're selling. They don't care how they're making a profit. They just care that people are shopping with them. So if more people buy tofu, more corporations will sell it, okay, or mock meats or whatever you want to say. So consumers really can have an impact at the marketplace. Now, social investing, which is one market-based solution, is something that I looked into when I was researching for my paper, and it's not there yet with respect to animals. You may have heard of these socially responsible investment funds. Well, myself and my research assistant analyzed those, and the only thing they screen for in terms of animal welfare is product testing. Like, you know, if you test a consumer product on an animal, which is a very small subset of animal experimentation, which itself is a very small subset of animal use, considering that factory farming and agriculture is 98%. No funds, not even the Sierra Club, which is amazing to me, given it's an environmental fund and the devastating environmental impact of animal agriculture. None of them screen for factory farming. So even if you invest in a socially responsible fund, think you're doing a good thing, you might be owning Smithfield Farms, Tyson Foods, McDonald's. So it's not quite there yet, and it's because there's no support for these things. But I do think voting with your dollars at the consumer marketplace is a very good thing. Anyone can buy vegan products or go to Tammy Bryant's vegan restaurant. No legislative compromise is required. You don't have to convince anybody else. You don't have to get your proposals watered down because nobody agrees with you. You can influence what you buy. You can influence what you buy. You simply reduce the demand for animal products and the number of corporations that will sell them and harm animals in the process by buying vegan products. Now, many struggles would have to be overcome to eradicate the property classification of animals, but I think this is a step in the right direction. I'm going to end, as I started, with a quote, this one from an egg industry executive in Georgia, my old state. The object of producing eggs is to make money. When we have forgotten this objective, we have forgotten what it's all about. He sounds like a traditional manager. To make this not about money, to recognize animals' inherent value instead of their exchange value, you have to remove them from the class of property and prohibit their corporate ownership. Only when we've done so will we truly leave the days of René Descartes behind us. Thank you.
Our final speaker, I'm proud to announce in this busy day, is Gaverick Matheny. He's an economist and does research at the University of Maryland, and his specialty is the economics of Our final speaker, I'm proud to announce in this busy day, is Gaverick Matheny. He's an economist and does research at the University of Maryland, and his specialty is the economics of agriculture.
Great. And I don't know if the projection room, if it's still staffed. Oh, great. Wonderful. All right. Well, I have both the luxury and the burden of everybody before me having said the important stuff. It seems like there isn't really a whole lot of debate here, so I kind of just want to play the hand of the factory farmer and try to make a steadied case for it, but I really don't think there is. I mean, I think it's a pretty absurd industry. I think it's one that doesn't have a moral foundation. It's certainly gratuitous, and given that it's our largest use of animals, it makes it all the more absurd, given that there's no nutritional need for any of these products. I guess I want to expand on some of the points that have already been discussed about the numerical dominance of farmed animals, particularly poultry and fish. Then I'll briefly describe standard farming practices in the U.S. and show how the U.S. has fallen behind Europe in its farm animal welfare regulation. Then I'm going to examine the problem of trade, which threatens to make legislation impotent both at the national and the state level, and then talk about how we can move forward, in particular what I think lawyers can contribute. So this chart shows slaughter and housing statistics for the United States. For 2003, the numbers have gone up even more, especially for poultry and farmed fish. As you can see, the vast majority of farm animals who live in the United States are either poultry or fish. In fact, as we said, that 98% of animals that we kill in the country are farmed animals, and thus, as Darian said, the animal welfare issue is really reducible numerically to the farm animal welfare issue. We could say even more that because about 97% of the farm animals are poultry and fish, the animal welfare issue is just reducible to two categories of animals, being poultry and fish, and that, in a way, efforts aimed at reducing consumption of pork, milk, beef, as horribly as those animals are treated, are in a way statistically insignificant and could in fact have the unwanted side effect of increasing consumption of products that involve more suffering per unit food. So here's a graph. You get the general idea. I think in some ways we should be concentrating on the number of life years, that is the duration that's spent in factory farms rather than the number of lives. I'm going to briefly show you some of the standard farming practices. Jeff spared you some of the more graphic aspects of slaughter. Here's a veal crate. The calves don't have enough room to turn around typically. They're very often tethered in place. This keeps the meat pale, keeps their bodies anemic. Here's a pig about to go to a fattening pen. Here are the fattening pens where the animals will spend months before being transported to slaughter. These are turkeys actually, but you can, the same conditions are true in broiler farms, chicken farms. You have tens of thousands of animals kept indoors at very high densities, living in their own wastes. They suffer scalds, burns on their bodies from the ammonia. About 20% of the birds suffer chronic pain from skeletal disease, from cardiovascular disease. They've been overbred to the point of structural collapse. These are egg-laying hens. This is where 98% of the eggs in the United States are produced in barren metal wire cages. About 90% of hens raised in these systems develop osteoporosis. Here is some cattle slaughter. And here's some chicken slaughter. And just to suggest how absurd all this is, obviously there is a disconnect between the way in which we treat domesticated animals that we have a lot of affection for and those that we never see, the farm animals. So how did we get to this point? Well, Darian touched on this. After World War II, there were several technologies that were introduced to animal farming to reduce the cost to consumers. These included modern genetics to breed more productive animals, protein-dense nutrition to maximize meat, egg, and milk production, these concentrated animal feeding operations, these indoor housing environments in which animals are stocked at very high densities in order to reduce land, labor, and feed costs, vaccines, antibiotics, vitamin D, to prevent diseases that emerge with these unnatural diets and these unnatural housing conditions. And the combination of these technologies, as you've heard, is colloquially referred to as factory farming. And indeed, factory farming has succeeded in reducing the costs of meat, eggs, and milk. but it's also come at a very high price for farm animals. I think a lot of the individual problems have already been discussed, and I think the lack of farm animal welfare legislation in the United States has already been reviewed in detail. So I'll just I'll move forward to a comparison with Europe, where things are different, though perhaps not as different as we would like. The European Union over the past 10 years has instituted lots of changes in regulation regarding the treatment of farm animals. In particular, they've banned several forms of husbandry that are commonplace in the United States. In fact, none of these practices are illegal in the United States, and yet all of them are being banned or phased out in Europe. So this includes density limits on housing, gestation crates, sow tethers, veal crates, veal tethers, battery cages, and even in some cases a complete ban on cages in Switzerland and soon in Germany. You know, I think despite this, and of course I didn't have a chart that showed you everything that's still left in Europe, because that would take up too much space. I think Gary's right that, you know, the regulation that does exist to protect farm animals doesn't go far enough, not nearly far enough, and it would be fair to call production in really all of those countries still forms of factory farming. There is not a significant market share outside of eggs for any non-factory farmed product really in any developed country, which is remarkable. And I think it maybe makes us not very optimistic about any kind of regulatory change in the United States that would be sufficient. I think much of the U.S. complacency towards factory farming owes to a very basic ignorance about the farming conditions and practices. And we know this both anecdotally, just by, I mean, if you go home today to your housemates or your colleagues and talk about the kinds of farming practices that you've learned about today, my guess is that it'll be news for most of them, and at least it is news for most of my friends. A 2003 Zogby poll found that 71% of respondents believe in general farm animals are fairly treated in the United States. But when actually asked about individual standard farming practices, most people object to them. A Zogby poll found that 86% of adults feel that the crowding of hens in commercial egg production is unacceptable, which is how 98% of hens are housed. And a poll by Opinion Research Corporation found that 90% of respondents objected to standard practices of confining veal calves, pigs, and hens. So we are left with the majority of Americans objecting to standard farming practices, but only after they're told what those practices are. We're just ignorant about how our meat, eggs, and milk are produced. Now, the situation is somewhat different in Europe, where a 2005 survey found that a majority of consumers believe that insufficient weight is given to animal welfare, and a majority rate the current welfare of poultry and fish as bad. The survey also found that the proportion of adults who have ever visited animal farms was highest in Scandinavia, more than 9 out of 10, I believe because actually of a school-based program where students are required to visit farms in Scandinavia during part of their tenure at school. And that also, Scandinavia has some of the world's strongest animal welfare protections. So this casts doubt, I think, on claims that are often made by U.S. agribusiness, that the growing concern about animal welfare in the United States is the product of growing urban ignorance about agriculture. I think on the contrary, the data suggests a high correlation between ignorance of animal agriculture and complacency about animal welfare. So I think I agree with everything that's been said here, last by Darian, that probably the biggest change that needs to happen is social education about what the practices are that are standard and customary in the United States. Now, industry could voluntarily abandon inhumane practices without regulation, and this could give us then some hope that in the United States, even lacking any kind of legislative change that significant progress could be made for animal welfare. But it rarely does, that is, industry rarely does voluntarily agree to meaningful changes. In fact, among U.S. producer associations, only the United Egg Producers has made any relevant reform, and by European standards, those are still paltry. Replacement of starvation diets for forced molting by now low nutrient diets, that is basically just like eating styrofoam, and an increase in cage space of several inches per bird, still smaller than a sheet of type-sized paper. Welfare assurance schemes for the other U.S. industry associations have merely codified existing practice. And in preparing for this, I looked through these guidelines, and it's amazing. I mean, it kind of, you know, these were the guidelines that are supposed to guide proper welfare under husbandry conditions, and yet they were worse than I actually imagined. You know, what was being recommended was worse than I thought customary practice was. Now, there are niche certifications such as USDA Organic, the Pig Welfare Standards of Animal Welfare Institute Certified Humane Label, the Free Farmed Label, which was talked about earlier, modeled after RSPCA's Freedom Food certifications. But the animal products certified with these assurances represent a fraction of 1% of the market. In fact, the market share of any non-factory farm system in the United States is around 2% for eggs and under 1% for every other animal product. And I think, although I disagree about the criticism of Whole Foods, which will soon be instituting very demanding welfare standards for chickens, I think the market share of these welfare-assured products is not likely to increase dramatically unless you get a company like Safeway or Kroger to commit to very meaningful changes, and probably changes that aren't economically feasible for them. Non-CAFO products do have higher market share in Europe. The market share of cage-free eggs is 20 to 60% in most of the northern European countries. All Swiss eggs are cage-free and 80% are free-range. But the share of non-CAFO meats is insignificant in most countries. Less than 1% of pork in France and Norway is free-range, and the only free-range meat product with significant market share throughout Europe is in France, a Label Rouge chicken, which has about 30% market share. So again, not very encouraging. We see both a failure of regulation and market-based reforms to adequately provide welfare for farm animals, even at the request of consumers, I think. Free-range meat and eggs are often sold at 2 to 3 times the price of conventional cage eggs. And you know, this is for most American consumers, this is our only experience with non-CAFO products, is just seeing the free-range eggs at now some mainstream groceries. The reason that it's marked up so much has more to do with niche marketing than with production costs. As you can see, many of the production costs for some reforms is relatively modest, but they suffer from not having an economy of scale, and of course the retailers are marking up these products because they realize who they're being sold to. So, for instance, given the 48% farm value share of retail price for poultry meat, a 5% increase in production costs for broilers, which is what it would take, really, to slow growth of broilers and reduce the level of chronic lameness, chronic pain from cardiovascular disease. It would probably solve the world's largest animal welfare problem, and it would only cost about 5% more per piece of chicken. So that's actually a piece of low-hanging fruit. It's a problem that we could solve pretty easily at the retail level. But you see, moving to the free-range systems, this does involve a more dramatic increase in costs that I think most producers would simply bow out of the market unless there were widespread adoption by producer associations, or they were forced to make changes by associations of retailers. consumers report a willingness to pay more for products that are labeled with welfare assurances, as Jeff Leslie noted. But unfortunately, the consumer's own statements about what they're willing to pay don't always translate into actual purchases, as revealed by the low market shares of these free-range products that I discussed earlier. And I think the misfit between consumers' stated intentions and their behavior owes in part to the lack of availability of these alternative products in many supermarkets and restaurants. I think it's also in part because of poor labeling. It's very difficult to tell what you're buying. And as I'll discuss earlier, I think that's an important role for lawyers to play in improving the quality of labeling. And it can also owe to a belief among consumers, which I think is widespread, that they're somehow not responsible for the animal welfare involved in the products that they buy, that instead the responsibility lies with government, with producers, or with retailers. I want to talk briefly about trade and the problem of substitution, because I think that this in a way obviates a lot of hopes that we could have for the power of legislation. Animal welfare legislation in Europe and more recently in Florida in the United States outlawed the use of particular production systems. In Europe, you saw the list of production systems. In Florida, it was banning the gestation crate. But both sets of legislation have a limited effect on animal welfare so long as consumers continue to demand and are supplied with products imported from nations or states that use the outlawed systems. And because an increasing share of the world's meat, eggs, and milk are being traded right now at around 10%, international trade and even interstate trade for a country like the United States represents a special problem for animal welfare legislation. As the European Commission noted, animal welfare standards, notably those concerning farm animal welfare, could be undermined if there's no way of ensuring that agricultural and food products produced to domestic animal welfare standards are not simply replaced by imports produced to lower standards. And the concern applies just as readily to interstate trade within the United States. For instance, following the Florida gestation crate ban, there was probably no reduction in the number of animals housed in gestation crates in the United States. One producer left the state, but there was probably no decrease in the demand among consumers for pork that came from pigs who came from sow farms where sows were raised in gestation crates. They simply came from sow farms in other states. As an example, the United Kingdom maintains higher animal welfare standards for sows than most EU countries, and since its ban on sow gestation crates and tethers in 1999, UK pork costs increased and production volume declined. And in 2005, more than half of all pork products in British supermarkets were imported. And more than 2/3 of those imports came from countries that used sow crates. So this is a real problem for the prospect of any regulation to truly reduce the number of animals raised in intensive confinement or slaughtered using any kind of more humane technique. So long as there is trade across boundaries, state boundaries or national boundaries, which allow the movement of products that don't conform to the standards that a particular legislature has enacted, there could be no net reduction in the amount of animal suffering. To give an example of how this will become an increasing problem internationally, the European Union has not yet attempted to restrict imports from countries that don't meet its own farm animal welfare standards, but if it tries, it may face resistance within GATT and the World Trade Organization. Protecting compliant producers from unfair competition with non-compliant producers will really depend on one or more of the following. Animal welfare considerations in Article 3 or Article 20 of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, some form of international standards that's binding, including developing countries that are increasing their trade to developed countries, labeling, tariffs, and green box provisions. And I won't go into this, but I would say that if you have the opportunity to take a trade law class, this is a place where I think lawyers could do a lot of good for farm animals. Right now, the problems seem pretty intractable because of negotiations on agricultural products, especially breaking down. Developing countries see the animal welfare standards that the European Union has in place as merely protectionist measures to prevent competition with cheaper producers. So if the European Union's poultry as they are, their own welfare standards have any hope of being protected, it's going to depend upon a reinterpretation of existing trade agreements. I think that the most practical means, though, for protecting animal welfare in the European Union as well as in the United States is to bypass the problem of trade altogether and, in large part, the problem of regulation altogether by pressuring retailers to carry only certain kinds of products that meet certain kinds of animal welfare standards. Now, while trade agreements can force nations to allow imports, they can't force supermarkets or restaurants to sell them. And in fact, countries like the United Kingdom and Germany have already pledged, their supermarkets have already pledged not to carry certain kinds of factory farmed products, even if GATT and WTO rule against national efforts to restrict imports. The largest animal welfare reforms in the United States, as Gary mentioned, this is an embarrassment, but they were initiated by McDonald's in 1999. And while I think it is true that we shouldn't be comforted by them very much, it does, I think, offer a glimpse at what our best hope of real significant improvements in animal welfare in the United States are. McDonald's informed its suppliers after about 5 years of constant campaigning by NGOs that McDonald's would be adopting new animal welfare requirements, including audits of slaughterhouses, increased cage space per hen, and a ban on forced molting. Following McDonald's announcement, its competitors, Wendy's and Burger King, followed suit. Burger King, in fact, increased the standards and even petitioned the USDA to actively enforce the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. Now, I think that the visibility and name recognition of retailers makes them the most sensitive target right now of animal welfare campaigns. It doesn't require costly legislative efforts, and as retailers compete with each other over public perception, successfully negotiating welfare gains with a major retailer can lead to a kind of race to the top. Even if that top isn't high enough, it can make things better for certainly millions of animals in the case of McDonald's. And it can also lead to a push for harmonizing regulations so that the costs are shared. So moving forward, trying to think of what advice would be for lawyers who want to have an impact here, I would say, the United States trails the developed world in farm animal welfare. There's virtually no legal protection for most farm animals in the country. Industry reforms in the United States are meager, and they haven't even approached governmental standards in Europe, which are themselves minimal. I think if the objective for us as animal welfare advocates is to do the greatest good for the greatest number, then animal protection NGOs should invest their finite resources in those efforts that are most cost-effective in reducing misery. And I think in particular, priority should be placed on those animals raised and killed, like poultry and fish, that comprise the vast majority of farm animals. This doesn't sit well, I think, with a lot of people because I think our compassion is somehow stronger innately maybe for pigs and cows, but the number of animal life years and the number of animal lives that they represent are 1% of the total. So even if we got rid of all pork and beef and even dairy production, we really would not have significantly affected animal agriculture in the United States. As I said, state legislation is very slow, it's expensive, and it's also impossible in most states for referenda. The Florida referendum cost $1 million, affected probably fewer than 2,500 animals in the state, and probably no animals in net. I think referenda and other legislation may have some symbolic value and draw media attention, raise public consciousness, but I doubt that they have any net effect on welfare in the United States unless they actually affect points of sale and limit interstate trade, which there is actually, we have an example of that, which is the California's ban on the sale of foie gras. I think that represents a good precedent. It's not good enough, but we need more like it if we're going to use state legislation to have an impact on animal welfare. But I think most importantly is to focus on the social education. Most Americans remain ignorant about the most basic aspects of factory farming, and yet I think the majority would be appalled to see what the conditions are really like. A broad public education campaign could, I think, make massive shifts in diet away from poultry, eggs, and fish, certainly reduce the worst kinds of animal treatment that are present in American farms. I would note that in contrast to Gary, I do think that there's a role for welfarist campaigns that's compatible with abolitionist objectives. Welfarist campaigns do tend to drive up production costs, and we then expect that those production costs drive down consumption. However, welfarist campaigns that are directed towards pigs and cattle could have a negative effect by shifting consumption to poultry and fish. So if there's one takeaway from this, it's really just talk about poultry and fish. So what can lawyers do? Well, I'm not very optimistic about the prospect of legislation that's sufficiently strong to satisfy all our concerns about farm animal welfare. The EU reforms are better than nothing, but they're not very much. I agree with Jeff Leslie that, that lawyers can do much to improve the information that consumers receive. They can also do work whose objective is to get press about standard farming practices. And I think the Humane Society of the United States and Compassion Over Killing have done a lot of work in that vein that's been successful in raising the image of factory farming to people who otherwise wouldn't see it. They can increase the costs of production by being a constant fly in the ointment. I think there's lots of work to be done there in environmental litigation against factory farms, as well as challenging tax breaks to producers. And I think lastly, what lawyers could do is, and perhaps most importantly, although I haven't decided for myself, is that you can become rich and donate all your money to organizations that are trying to educate consumers about factory farming and reduce their consumption of animal products. Thank you.
The conference is officially over, but I'm sure there will be some questions for those who have to leave. We're so glad that you came. Thank you very much. I'm delighted by the attendance. But now, are there questions for the panelists on this topic about big business and animals? Yes.
Right, just something that I just happened to run across on the internet. In Greensboro, Guilford County, North Carolina, I noticed a little piece in the paper about Petland. Everybody knows what Petland is and their reputation. But now they are going to be working with the Guilford County Animal Shelter and have shelter animals in there. Well, you know what you're talking about? That's just going to increase, you know, their sales. More people are going to come into Petland, you know, and buy their food, dog food, and buy all their products there, and think they're doing a good thing because Petland is working with the shelter. But it's a financial move. I mean, I know it is, and they're trying to build their reputation up because Petland is, their reputation is shot all over the United States. Everybody knows. In fact, in some places, they're even changing their name because they've got such a bad reputation. They're even changing their name and not using the word Petland anymore.
Darian, you want to respond to that?
I don't shop at Petland.
I shop at Petland.
I think you illustrate perfectly the danger of the branding problem, and that and that's one of the concerns I really hope I talked about in my, is that I think that while there probably are some improvements, the public relations, the information flow is controlled by the corporations, and consumers don't have time to investigate these things like us academics with no real jobs have time to do. So, you know, people say, well, this company is doing better, and especially if you get somebody like Peter Singer saying, well, McDonald's is doing a great thing, then people say, well, Peter Singer says it's okay, so it's got to be okay. So I think that that's the real issue, is that it's a branding, the appearance of welfare rather than actual welfare, and that's gonna make consumers feel comfortable, as Gary talked about, and continue to buy these things and shop at these places rather than avoiding it altogether, which is the only fail-safe way to help animals.
Sir.
One sort of question. It seems like probably the only answer to this eventually is to quit eating animals. And you mentioned the idea, the last speaker did, of a broad-based campaign to do this. And my question is, well, for example, there's a really nice film called The Witness that was produced by Tribe of Heart some years ago. They struggle and struggle and struggle. I do a little community TV show, and I couldn't put them on my show because they don't have a national showing of it yet. They finally get a national showing of some little segment of the society. But my question is, given that kind of mentality and the people who control the media being the people eventually who own the meat factories, how do you do a broad-based campaign? What kind of suggestions do you have? How can we accomplish that?
Well, I think Compassion Over Killing has a great idea, which is that you find that first you look for the lowest hanging group, which group of consumers is probably most sensitive to the issue of farm animal welfare, and I think it's teen girls. It's teenagers in general, but particularly teenage girls who really care about animals already and kind of make the connection. So Compassion Over Killing designs these great 30-second MTV ads that target teen girls, and they get great response on it. I mean, they get thousands of requests for their vegetarian or vegan starter guides from these commercials. So I think that's probably the strategy we should take. We should think of it like a marketing problem. So who is our audience, and what's the behavior that we want to change?
In other words, so I guess I'd like to figure out a way, for example, to have CBS have that new movie that come out, Earthlings, as their Saturday night special or something. Is there any way to legislate that kind of thing? Because, we couldn't even get public TV to put The Witness on here. They hemmed and hawed and said, oh, well, maybe we could just in the North Carolina, just in the Raleigh, station. But, oh, no, we can't do that. Forget it. And it was a matter of some struggle on people's part to try to get them to show it. Just, is there any way to, other than the little 30-second commercial here, there, and yonder, is there any way to do that big Billy Graham type, come down here to the altar and promise you won't ever eat meat again type thing? Or do we need a Billy Graham like that?
I think one of the things that we have to recognize in terms of our society is that legislation is overrated. We can't legislate people's beliefs. We can't force. The law codifies norms. It doesn't create them. And so the way to get this movie on CBS is to get people to want to see it. The law can't do that. So then it becomes a matter of, well, how do you get people to want to see it? And that, I think, is what Gaverick's referring to when we talk about, you get people at a time when they're receptive to this message, and eventually that becomes the decision-making generation, and that decision-making generation cares and wants to see it. And that, that I think far more than any kind of legislative or legal framework is the effective avenue here.
And I'll just add that, corporations control the big media stations. If people want to watch this stuff and they're going to watch CBS if it puts it on instead of NBC, then that you've got to change value preferences, because everything, laws, what corporations offer, products, they're all reflections of value. So I think you have to start there.
One final question, back there.
This is for the gentleman on the right. Sorry, your name escapes me. My right.
Other right.
Yes. So I really liked your sort of concept of this post-human rights framework. But my question is that that seems kind of in opposition to like a principle of equality that would prevent, for example, like the differential application of like rights or entitlements based on like race or gender or even like intelligence or something, right? If you're breaking into those component categories. And so how would you sort of address that question, I guess? I
think that's an important point, and it's it's not necessarily in contrast to it, but it has to acknowledge that. And the way I would respond to you is that this would be a work in progress, but we have to acknowledge that any kind of positive law framework, which is effectively all legal frameworks, are inherently arbitrary. And so that's why you have people in North Korea with a different set of legal rights than we have. And why? Because that's the set of entitlements to which their society has determined they're entitled. Do we agree with that? Not necessarily. But how do we construct a post-human legal framework? We do that by acknowledging that there are a set of differences that are aimed at happiness, or I should say content. Happiness is anthropomorphizing, a comfort level. Different beings require different things for comfort. Is there the potential for abuse and using humans as the benchmark, as Tammy was talking about earlier? Yes, there certainly is. And how do we go about creating a positive law framework as humans that is aimed at the comfort level of non-humans? I don't know. I really don't know. I guess I would say that this is a way to any kind of normative framework aims at ideals, and so as you work towards something, I believe that's progress. I don't have a goal that I can articulate for you that's going to say this. If we can just do this, everything's going to be fine. But I can say that as we work towards this, it's going to get better.
Thank you all very, very much, and have a wonderful weekend.